Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a pretty heavy situation. What happened near Rafah in Gaza back on March 23rd.
Yeah, a very serious incident with 15 Palestinian medics and a UN staffer, losing their lives.
Right, really tragic. And for this, we've got quite a few sources to sort through. News reports, of course. We've got AP, Financial Times, The New York Times, The Guardian, all covering it.
And critically, we have statements and information from both the Palestine Red Crescent Society, the PRCS, and the UN directly.
Exactly. So our aim here, in this deep dive, is to try to untangle these different stories being told about what happened.
Yeah, to understand what role, the evidence itself plays in really getting to the bottom of this.
So to kick things off, let's look at what the Israeli military said initially.
Right, their first statements.
They said the medics' vehicles were, quote, advancing suspiciously towards their troops.
Okay, suspiciously.
They also said these vehicles, get this, had no headlights on, no emergency signals, and that the whole convoy was moving without any prior coordination.
So right away, they're painting a picture.
Yeah, it's specific, right?
Yeah.
What does framing it this way right from the start, what does that do?
Well, that initial framing is crucial. When you suggest suspicious behavior, right, and you emphasize a lack of clear identification on these vehicles, it implies a potential threat.
Right.
Which, can then be used to try and justify the use of force.
Of course.
The details about, no coordination, no lights, no signals, it all builds this initial narrative.
The balanced immediately there's a problem with this narrative because pretty strong evidence comes out. We're talking about video footage obtained by the New York Times and released by the PRCS as well.
Got it.
Now, here's the thing. This video was found on the phone of one of the paramedics who was killed.
Wow.
A man named Rifat Radwan.
Okay, so from one of the victims themselves.
Directly. What does that do for how much we believe this evidence?
That's huge. The fact that it was, on his phone, that lends an incredible authenticity to it.
Yeah.
It's firsthand. It's from someone right there in the moment. It makes it very hard to dismiss.
So what does this video actually show us?
Right. What's in the footage?
Okay, so you clearly see ambulances and a file truck in this video.
Mm-hmm.
All of them are clearly marked, no question about it, with Red Crescent logos and civil defense markings.
Okay.
And here's the key. They're emergency lights, they're flashing, they're active. You can see them as they're driving.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the footage shows they were moving slowly.
Slowly. Okay.
This seems to directly contradict what the Israeli military initially said. No lights, no signals. So what does that say to us?
Well, that contradiction is really important. Video evidence like this, it's visual. It's very difficult to refute. The fact that it clearly shows these lights, the markings, immediately makes you question, was that first statement from the military even accurate? It really underscores how you can't just take initial reports at face value, especially in these conflict situations. You need more. You need corroboration.
And it seems like the Israeli military realized this too. Because shortly after this video goes public, a military official from Israel admits their first account was mistaken. Specifically, they say that the whole claim about no emergency signals, that was based on wrong information, inaccurate testimony from the unit involved.
Okay.
They even said, and this is a quote, "What we understand currently is that the person who gave the initial account was mistaken. We're trying to understand why."
Trying to understand why. So what does this admission tell us about, how they review things internally?
Yeah.
Well, it at least shows that they're doing some internal review when faced with outside evidence. That's a good sign. But the question is, why was that initial account so inaccurate? Was it a genuine mistake? Maybe under pressure things get misreported, or was there another reason?
Right.
The fact that they're trying to understand why suggests there's an investigation going on. What they find out will be really important.
But then the story changes again. The Israeli military comes out with a revised version of events.
Okay, a new version.
They now say their troops had been in that same area earlier. They had conducted an ambush.
Okay.
Targeting and killing what they claim were Hamas operatives.
Okay.
And when the medics convoy shows up, the forces they believed it was more Hamas members and opened fire.
So they're saying it wasn't suspicious vehicles, it was mistaken identity in a high-tension situation.
Right. How does this revised account try to justify their actions?
Well, by saying they believed it was Hamas, they're suggesting the medics were misidentified as a threat, a continuing threat, because it was a recent combat zone.
Right.
It shifts the focus away from what the medics were actually doing and onto the environment the soldiers were in, their state of mind.
Right. They were on edge. They were expecting more enemies.
Exactly.
But they go even further. They claim they identified some of the dead medics as militants.
Oh.
Specifically, they mention a Hamas figure named Mohammed Amin Shabaki. But, and this is another big contradiction, none of the 15 medics who were identified were named that. And no other bodies were found at the site, only those of the 16 humanitarian workers.
So no evidence to support this claim of militants being there.
None. What does that mean?
Well, it really wakens this revised narrative. If there's no evidence to support the claim that these were militants, especially this specific person they named who doesn't match anyone,
right,
it makes you wonder, what are these claims based on? Are they just trying to justify the killings after the fact?
And when asked for details, for evidence to back up these claims, the military said they're relying on classified intelligence.
Oh, classified, so we can't see it.
Right. How does that affect our ability to know what really happened?
That makes it really hard to verify anything independently. I mean, sure, there might be good reasons to keep something secret, for security.
Yeah, right.
But it also prevents anyone from checking if it's true. And it can lead to distrust, especially when you already have these conflicting stories and no other real evidence.
Yeah.
They're essentially saying, trust us, we can't show you why.
So let's switch gears and look at how the Palestine Red Crescent Society and the UN have responded to all of this.
Okay, their perspective.
The PRCS, they've called these killings a massacre, straight up.
Yeah.
They're demanding an independent investigation. They say, flat out, they don't trust any investigation done by the Israeli military. Yunus al-Khatib, head of the PRCS, said, quote, "We don't trust any of the army investigations."
Strong words.
He also said the medics were targeted at close range. What does that kind of language tell us and this demand for an independent investigation?
It shows how deeply they feel this loss and how little faith they have that the Israeli military can investigate this fairly.
Right.
Their demand for an independent probe, it's a direct response to these changing stories, the evidence that contradicts those first statements from the military.
Right.
And that detail about them being targeted at close range, if that's true, that suggests as a deliberate act, not some mistake from far away.
And the UN has also condemned these killings strongly. Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has even raised the possibility of war crimes, saying the killings, quote, raise further concerns over the commission of war crimes by the Israeli military.
War crimes, that's serious.
Both the PRCS and the UN, they insist that everyone who was killed was clearly identifiable as a humanitarian worker, no threat at all. Jonathan Whittall from OCHA said, quote, "These are paramedic crews that I personally have met before. They were buried in their uniforms with their gloves on. They were ready to save lives." What does this unified stance from these organizations mean?
Well, it shows the human side of this tragedy. It makes it clear that these were people who were there to help, not to fight. And the UN raising the possibility of war crimes really shows how serious they consider this incident. It could have legal consequences.
What happened to the bodies after the incident is really disturbing.
Oh.
There are reports that the bodies, all 16 of them, the medics and the UN staffer, were bulldozed over, along with their vehicles, and then buried in a mass grave.
Bulldozed and buried.
It took a whole week for UN and rescue workers to get to the site and recover the bodies.
A week.
And tragically, one of the medics, Assad al-Nasasra, he's still missing.
Still missing.
What does this say? The bulldozing, the delay in getting access to the site?
That's very concerning. It raises questions about how the deceased were treated and whether there was an attempt to destroy evidence. The week-long delay, that hinders any immediate investigation.
Right.
It causes more distress for the families and the organizations involved. And the fact that someone is still missing, that just adds another layer of tragedy and uncertainty.
There's also an account from one of the paramedics who survived, Munzer Abed.
Okay, survivor's account.
He says he saw Assad al-Nasasra, the missing medic, being led away by Israeli troops, blindfolded.
Oh, wow.
The PRCS has said they've asked the Israeli military directly about his whereabouts. How important is this kind of eyewitness testimony in figuring out what happened?
It's incredibly valuable. It's a first-hand account that can either support or contradict other information. Mr. Abed's claim that he saw the missing medic being led away blindfolded, that's a significant detail. The Israeli military needs to address that.
Now, regarding the bodies, an Israeli military official did offer an explanation. He said they covered the bodies with sand to prevent animals from getting to them.
Okay, to protect them.
But he couldn't explain why the vehicles were also buried. While protecting the bodies is understandable, burying the vehicles too, does that explanation make sense?
It's harder to accept that explanation if the vehicles were buried too. Makes you wonder if maybe they were trying to hide damage to the vehicles or other evidence at the scene. It needs more clarification.
Let's go back to that video footage for a minute.
Okay.
It was filmed from inside one of the vehicles, as we said.
Right.
It clearly shows the Red Crescent and civil defense vehicles. The lights are flashing, logos are visible. It also captures the moment the heavy gunfire starts, which happens right after the medics get out of their vehicles.
They got out.
Yeah, presumably to help another ambulance that had been hit.
Okay, so they were trying to help. What did the audio and the video tell us?
It adds a lot, actually. You
Yeah.
hear the gunfire, it gives you a real sense of the danger and the chaos.
Yeah, the sounds can really bring you into that moment.
There's also the sound of prayers being said, which often means people are terrified.
Right, a moment of extreme distress.
And there's a very poignant part where the man who owned the phone, he says, quote, "Forgive me, Mother. This is the path I chose, Mother, to help people."
Wow.
It really makes this tragedy hit home. You know, it shows how selfless these people were.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
There's also a chilling line you hear towards the end, "The Jews are coming." In the context of this conflict, what could that phrase mean?
In that situation, that phrase speaks volumes about the fear and the deep divisions in this conflict. It reflects a feeling of imminent threat, the anxiety that exists there.
Munzer Abed, the survivor, he confirmed that the video is real.
Okay.
And he said his ambulance also had its siren on when they were fired upon. He describes what happened next, and it's really disturbing. He was dragged out of the ambulance, they stripped him, beat him, interrogated him, and then he saw the soldiers firing on other medical vehicles as they arrived. How does his account fit into the overall picture?
His testimony is horrific. It goes against the idea that the soldiers saw the medics as a real threat. It raises serious questions about the soldiers' conduct, whether they were targeting humanitarian workers on purpose.
So the sequence of events is pretty clear. First, there's this initial strike, which is why the medics were called out. Then, the dispatch of ambulances and a fire truck, all clearly marked. Then the ambush happens, followed by a whole week before anyone could recover the bodies. And finally, the video comes out and changes the Israeli military story. What does this timeline highlight?
It shows how long it took to recover the bodies and how long it took for the truth, or at least a different version of the truth, to come out. This kind of delay can make people suspicious, especially in a conflict zone where information is often hard to get.
Sadly, this whole thing reflects some worrying patterns we see in this conflict. You get these initial stories that turn out to be wrong, then revisions, but only when there's independent evidence.
Right, like that video in this case.
And it raises questions about who's being held accountable, how transparent these investigations really are.
Yeah, transparency is key.
Then you have the claims about militants being involved, but no real proof to back it up. It's all very murky, and there's a lot of distrust. What does this tell us about trying to understand and deal with these events in such a complex conflict?
It shows how hard it is to get to the truth in a conflict zone. You have conflicting information, a lack of trust, and sometimes a deliberate attempt to hide what really happened. It's a reminder that we need independent investigations and a commitment to transparency from all sides if we want to understand these situations and prevent them from happening again.
We also can't ignore the potential war crimes that are being talked about and the international scrutiny that comes with something like this. And what happened with the bodies, the bulldozing, the burial, the initial denial of access for humanitarian workers, it's a bad look. It suggests a lack of respect for those trying to help. And we can't forget that the UN has reported that over 150 emergency responders and 1,000 health workers have been killed in this conflict already. What does that tell us?
It's a tragedy. It shows how dangerous it is to be a humanitarian worker in this conflict, and it raises serious concerns about whether international law is being followed. All sides have a responsibility to protect aid workers and medical personnel.
Finally, it's worth pointing out that even within the revised story the Israeli military gave, there are inconsistencies about when the medics arrived at the scene compared to when the ambush they claim happened was taking place.
Right, so even their news story doesn't quite hold together.
Exactly. How does that affect how much we can believe their explanation?
Those inconsistencies make their explanation less believable. It makes you wonder if they're telling the whole story, or if they're just trying to cover something up. Again, it reinforces the need for an independent investigation that can get to the bottom of what happened.
So to wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway here is how much the Israeli military's explanation changed.
Right, a complete shift.
And that change only happened when the video came out, undeniable proof that contradicted their initial story. This raises some huge questions about what really happened and the whole context of this conflict. What's the larger significance of that? The fact that their first account was so quickly and clearly proven wrong by independent evidence.
It shows how important it is to have independent sources of information, especially in conflict zones where governments and militaries often control the narrative. It also shows how powerful video evidence can be in challenging official accounts and demanding accountability.
Exactly. It really makes you think as a listener about how we can ever understand what's really going on in these complex situations without independent oversight, without transparent investigations.
It's a challenge, no doubt, but it's a challenge we need to address if we want to prevent more tragedies like this from happening.
On that note, here's something to consider. Given all these discrepancies and the calls for an independent investigation, what does this incident tell us about how difficult it is to find the truth and get justice in a conflict zone? Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.